The Spin-off Podcast Network.
Are you making the most of your KiwiSaver investment? Generate is an award-winning KiwiSaver provider with a track record of strong long-term performance. Making a smart decision now could add tens of thousands of dollars by the time you reach retirement. Book a no-obligation chat with a Generate KiwiSaver advisor today at generatekiwisaver.co.nz/get-advice. A copy of the product disclosure statement is available at generatekiwisaver.co.nz. The issuer of the scheme is Generate Investment Management Limited, and of course, past performance does not guarantee future returns.
I'm Toby Manhire, and this is Juggernaut, the story of the Fourth Labour Government, a podcast in 6 parts.
Doesn't give my opponents much time to run up to an election, does it?
This nation is at risk.
What do you think you're up to now, you perverted little liar?
I could smell the uranium on it as you lean towards it.
There's a radical overhaul in the history of New Zealand's administration.
Juggernaut, the story of the Fourth Labour Government, made with the support of New Zealand On Air. Listen now on the Spin-off or wherever you get your podcasts. Tēnā koutou katoa, this is Toby Manhire with a special crossover edition of Gone By Lunchtime meets When the Facts Change with me and Bernard Hickey. Kia ora, Bernard.
Yes, we are the co-pro, the SUV of podcasts.
A hybrid, maybe?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
We could try.
But we're now having to pay some extra money to the government for some reason.
Oh, okay. Right. We should get to that. Nicola Willis delivered her first budget this afternoon. We're talking on May the 30th, just after 3 o'clock. So just over an hour ago, Nicola Willis stood up in the House. They're currently going back and forth in Parliament. And it was a bit of a no surprises budget. I think that was, I don't think there was an attempt to pull any particular rabbits or other rodents from any headwear. It was, Bernard, we're in this bit of a economic malaise. We're on this great search for the missing mojo of 2024. And the tax cut was the centrepiece. The plan was, correct me if I'm wrong, to provide some relief on cost of living pressures, to show that the cloth is being cut, to brighten the mood a bit, but not to inflame inflation, not to do anything to stall any move towards lowering the interest rates. Was that the story that Nicola Willis was hoping to write today?
Yes, that's the framing, that she was going to give us some tax relief and it wasn't going to stimulate the economy, and she was going to do it by removing wasteful spending and adding a few tiny little taxes here and there. And you're right, she's broadly met that self-described target, and that's because she's delivered tax relief, she calls it, tax cuts of $2.57 billion on average per year. And there are some threshold changes, and there will be some improvements for some people. There's a good $150 million worth of in-work tax credits that have come through, and about $730 million for residential rental property investors. So when you look at it, we're talking about $3.5 billion a year extra, if you like, going out to taxpayers, which over the 4 years, we're talking about $12 billion, which magically is actually the exact increase in the borrowing program.
Yes. Now, but wait, Bernard. To be clear, our tax package is fully funded through savings and new revenue measures, which means it will not add to government debt. Is it an accounting question or is it a semantic question?
It's a semantic question, because what has actually happened here, the big picture from 40,000 feet, is the economy has slowed more than the government expected. So it's got less money coming into the coffers, particularly in corporate tax revenues, and also lower GST and income taxes than would otherwise be the case. So they would say they've inherited $14 billion less that they could use, and that's why they've had to borrow around about the same extra. However, the net effect of all of this economic slowdown since the election is that the government's still going to have to borrow an extra $12 billion. Now, their argument from the start was these are going to be tax cuts that will not be funded by borrowing. And net, these are tax cuts funded by borrowing. And that's because the economy's worse than expected. Now, National would say, well, that's all still Labor's fault. You know, we're only 6 months in. But actually, not when you talk to people who are actually doing things in the economy. For example, the construction sector. We got new business confidence figures out yesterday showing another slump in confidence from the construction sector. Just last month, the big four in the construction sector, infrastructure, house building, wrote a desperate letter to Chris Bishop to say, please restart these projects that you had in your pipelines. Give us some work to do. It's not like we don't have work to do with building lots of things. But of course, the key thing was as soon as the government got in, it very abruptly repealed Three Waters, repealed RMA work, shut down a lot of transport projects, including Let's Get Wellington Moving, the Auckland Light Rail project. And all of those things, along with big uncertainties about funding going from the government to councils, has essentially created a vacuum. The whole economy around construction in particular is in a state of suspended animation. And that, along with a lot of noise about how the government's going to tighten its belt and cut spending and cut jobs, about 5,000 so far in the public sector, has shocked confidence in the economy in a way that even I think the government's surprised at. They have talked their way into a deeper recession. So, this argument that, well, we've got less money because the economy's worse because it's Labor's fault. Well, actually, it's partly National's fault. In the last 6 months, they have talked their way into a longer, deeper recession, which now they're going to have to pay for with borrowed money.
Having said that, were Labor still the government, many of the forecasts would still be getting gloomier, wouldn't they? I mean, that's simply the reality of lots of the trajectories.
Well, actually, when you look at what's happened in the last 6 months in terms of business confidence, consumer confidence, retail spending, there have been some real changes in those 6 months because of what the government's done. And also, when you look at the rest of the world, there's this impression people have at the moment when they think about the world economy that it's bad, it's getting worse all the time. Well, actually, no. The OECD came out last week and said the economic outlook globally is improving somewhat in the last 12 months in most places. And the exception, of course, New Zealand, because there is a self-imposed freeze on new railways, development work, and also on capital help for councils. And they didn't get much help in this budget with that. There's no signs that I could see of any GST sharing. And that is going to keep the economy in a state of suspended animation. And of course, macroeconomics 101, it's not like a household, despite what Nicola Willis would say. And when you cut government spending, there is a multiplier effect. And that is playing out through the economy at the moment.
I mean, that puts a lot of, I suppose, weight or expectation on the fast track legislation, doesn't it, to kind of unclog some of those pipes and get the activity going again?
Yeah, and this is the problem here. This is not going to come through and start working until the end of the year at best. And there's still a lot of uncertainty about what's going to replace RMA. And to be frank, apart from in Auckland, where a special deal has been done, the Three Waters has not been replaced. And there's an awful lot of work that has been put on hold by councils because they don't know what's going to happen next. A good example, just this week in Christchurch, in their long-term plan discussions, councillors were told there were 800 water projects that needed doing, and the council could only find funds for 500 of them. 26% of their water is now leaking regularly, and they had hoped to improve it to 20, but won't get there in the next 4 or 5 years. This is what's happened. The government has frozen funding for infrastructure at a time when it needs to be invested. And the one problem for the economy and the government that it can't control is what councils do. It can help them with revenue and capital, but they make their own decisions. And right now they have locked up their workloads. And when you look at the bleeding edge of the business confidence surveys, and in particular things like how architects and designers and surveyors are feeling about the world. They are pretty down and warning the government that unless there's an improvement, they'll see extra people leaving. And we're already seeing that 166 people every day, New Zealanders every day, leaving to live and work overseas, and just over half of those going to Australia.
It'll be interesting to see whether the tax cuts have any effect on metrics like that, whether they lift the mood, whether they lift the confidence, whether they sort of shift the dial at all in terms of, forgive me saying it again, the mojo. They're much as they were promised by the National Party. They are, Nicola Willis says they're modest but meaningful. One of the strongest arguments for them, of course, is that it's, you know, it only goes some way to correcting the bracket creep that we've seen over the past 14 years. So it's hardly profligate from that point of view. They were promised in the election, so there's a mandate for them. That's clear enough. There's the inflationary point, but more generally, given all of the circumstances that are encountered, given the economic weather, is there some sense in which Nicola Willis might be wishing that she hadn't, she hadn't offered to resign if she didn't introduce them? You look at Australia recently, where their version of cost of living relief was an energy rebate, which was to be delivered in the power bill for every household, and therefore was quite expressly designed to hit the target that really matters in terms of growing people's sense of optimism or confidence is interest rates, right? Like that's the key measure. Do you think that if that hadn't been an election promise, this money, if it was still to be spent, might have been geared in a different way?
Yeah, that's one of the problems for the government with this first budget. So much of it was pre-cooked, as much in their own election manifesto as in the coalition agreements. And they didn't really have a free hand to respond to the changes in the outlook, events, dear boy, as they say. And that's the problem that she may be able to shake off now. You know, we've delivered the things that we said we would in the election, and now we have to dodge and weave the bullets as they come and not be locked in place by these agreements. However, of course, New Zealand First and ACT aren't standing still, and they can feel pretty happy with what they've got, including Shane Jones, who's gotten himself a big old juicy fund today to go out there and talk about with people in meetings. So that will be an interesting challenge for the government politically. Also, they start on the back foot. This has been the fastest collapse in support for any government in its first 6 months since the 1990-1991 lead up to the mother of all budgets. And I think towards the end of the year, if there hasn't been an improvement in National's popularity, and in particular of Christopher Luxon, and then there's a risk for the government of political turmoil, particularly if all of those gnats on the backbench start getting grumpy that New Zealand First and ACT are getting too much bang for their buck.
A long way to the next election, 2026. Look, it's creeping up on us. And whatever it's called, the kind of pathway to a surplus, they've managed to hang on to the year 27-28 and that's important from a political standpoint apart from anything else, because you need at very least to be going into that election as a national-led government saying, we're nearly there. We're nearly back in surplus. We're not getting, if you continue growing the debt as a national government over a full term, that is a real problem, given your main catch call. The way that they're getting there in part is by cutting right back that operating allowance, right? That kitty for discretionary spending. Labor had it at $3.5 billion. Nationals put it to $3.2 billion, but then markedly in the 2 years that follow down to $2.4 billion, which in real terms is quite a substantial reduction. It gives you, if you stick to that, Nicola Willis says she's determined to, that really limits your flexibility, your ability to be able to address as you said, the unknowns, the events, dear boy, that's tight.
Yeah, and also not a lot of room to do things for the big projects you've got planned. If you're all about building the motorways and boosting housing supply, the money's got to come from somewhere. Now, the government would argue, well, we'll get help from the private sector, we'll get PPPs, but they are slow, expensive, and the government itself has been advised by the main builder of these PPPs, the inheritor of the Crown Fibre holdings, that actually the most that they can hope to get with these sorts of public-private partnerships and infrastructure funding and financing deals that involve the private sector are about a tenth of what they need. So this is the issue here. As you come off the back of a year or two of recession, the last year or so of your term starts to get ugly. And one of the things to remember that those forecasts of rising debt and of deficits are actually driven more by the economic outlook than they are by policy decisions. And they'll be hoping, really crossing their fingers, that in the next year or two, Treasury starts changing those forecasts. The trouble is, macroeconomics and the finances of a government are not like the finances of a household. If you and I cut our spending to less than our income, things improve. We may not enjoy life so much, but when a government consistently cuts its spending and the contribution to the economy, there is a circular effect, particularly if you add to it with a shock to sentiment for businesses and consumers. That's what we've seen so far. And that's the risk for the government, that by the time we get to the election in 2026, we're barely out of a recession and the books look worse, mostly because of that weak economy than they expected. And, a lesson in Macroeconomics 101 is being delivered to the government about how a government is not like a household. It's a tough time to learn that lesson, though. Do you find it hard staying optimistic with all the financial news in the media? I'm Bernard Hickey, and on my podcast, When the Facts Change, I'm here to help you navigate the ever-changing landscape of economics in Aotearoa. So join the conversation every Friday on When the Facts Change, brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network in partnership with KiwiBet.
Kia ora, I'm Duncan Grieve, founder of The Spin-Off. You can help us keep all of The Spin-Off's award-winning journalism free for everybody by becoming a member today at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
Leaving that clear A plot to one side, anything else in there, Bernard, that springs out of you? Any other surprises, delights, disappointments?
Well, if you looked at the government like it was a company, and in fact like a household in terms of, how much wealth have you got at the end of it? How much are you worth? Actually, the government's net worth is forecast to fall from $189 billion to $184 billion by 2027. When it had increased since 2017 from 116 billion to 191 billion. That's for a bunch of reasons, mostly to do with the government having a bit more debt, but also the slowdown in the economy. So I just think if people are obsessed with this business of seeing the government as a household and measuring its performance as if it was a household or a company, which we've seen done, we certainly saw it with Kāinga Ora in the last few weeks, then this government is forecasting a significant reduction in the net worth of the government itself. Now, I think that's actually not a good way to look at government. It isn't like a household or a corporate. And there are other ways to do this, but we're not addressing the major issues that we have, which are not enough investment in public infrastructure that allows us to have the housing and the hospitals and the schools for our faster than expected population growth, and we're not doing the things to reduce our emissions and improve housing affordability. None of those things were addressed here in the government's first budget, and unless you see a significant change of tack and actually a change of personnel, you can't see that changing in the next 2 to 3 years.
And the other broader, wide-angle lens view on this government's approach, the previous government's approach, many governments' approach, is we've got this situation where superannuation, health, to a certain extent education, continue to cost more. They cost more and more. And at some point, something has to give, doesn't it? Like, just to bring this out to the much, much wider conversation in terms of whether it's the tax system, the accounts as a whole, there needs to at some point be a paradigm shift to address that, doesn't there?
Yeah. I mean, when you've got pressure on a system like this, it's like an engine or a steam turbine. You see steam start to escape in the weak points. You see the engine start to rumble badly, and oil start to drip from the gaskets that are blown. And our gaskets that are blowing are in some of our poverty measures. So, a number of people who need to get help with food. We're seeing it in our crime measures and in the number of people in prison. And for me, the main exit valve, the main escape valve, where you can see the weakness in the economy blowing out, is just in the number of people who have choices and are exercising those choices to leave. We saw it to an extent in 2010-11 when the economy was slowing down like this. And remember, we're in the middle of a per capita GDP recession that's as big as the 2008-2009 recession. And 166 people a day are leaving permanently. These are New Zealand citizens, because they can't see things changing in the system to make it affordable to have a family here. And one of the other slightly interesting and worrying things, I actually read the budget documents from the back to the front. And one of them is, the most interesting bits is around fiscal risks. And it's interesting, for the first time, the Treasury is talking at quite a bit of length about the fiscal risks for the government of not reaching its Paris target agreements. It hasn't gone to the extent of writing in a big number a liability the government's going to have to make up for. But there's a good $10 to $20 billion worth of emissions credits we're going to have to buy over the next 5 or 6 years if we choose to carry through on the Paris agreements rather than renege. And that's one of these liabilities we're building up. You're exactly right. If you exert pressure, at some point things blow, and you certainly push away problems. You essentially don't do your care and maintenance on the engine. The gaskets wear out, and you're building up a maintenance backlog for the future. In a way, we're already there. From the last 20 or 30 years of underinvestment, you're seeing the gaskets blow in all sorts of ways. Water quality, the sorts of problems with mental health spending growth, justice costs, these sorts of things. They are the signs of the engine blowing its gasket.
Bernard, thank you. It's been fun, mostly. He's Bernard Hickey for When the Facts Change. I'm Toby Manhire for Gone By Lunchtime. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Thank you.
Are you curious about how business can be better? I'm Simon Pound, and I host Business is Boring, a podcast where I kōrero with some of the most interesting people in entrepreneurship, commerce, and making things happen. Tune in to Business is Boring every Tuesday, brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network in partnership with Spark Business Lab.
Kia ora e te iwi, Te Aihe Butler here, podcast manager at the Spin-Off. If you enjoy listening to our podcasts, consider supporting our mahi by signing up to become a Spin-Off member at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
The Spin-Off Podcast Network.